The Galactic Council Chamber floated in high orbit above the ancient world of the Sara, its crystalline walls reflecting the light of 3 distant suns, and they, representatives of 47 species, gathered in a vast circular arrangement that had stood for 12,000 years. Ambassador Kelleran of the Voth delegation adjusted his sensory fronds as he studied the newcomers with mild curiosity, and these humans seemed so remarkably unremarkable in their basic bipedal form, with no natural armor plating like the Krull possessed, and no venomous spines like the Desseran people had evolved, and certainly none of the size advantage that made the Garth so imposing during trade negotiations. The human delegation stood in the presentation circle with their leader introducing herself as Ambassador Chung, and she spoke in clear, measured tones about Earth's desire to join the galactic community and participate in trade and cultural exchange and scientific cooperation. Kalan found them pleasant enough, if somewhat primitive in their enthusiasm, and they reminded him of the Palan people who had joined in the council 3 centuries ago, with similar wide-eyed wonder at the vastness of civilized space. What struck most observers as peculiar were the human habits that seemed to serve no practical purpose whatsoever, and they maintained something called gymnasiums on their ships, where they would repeatedly lift heavy objects for no reason other than to make their muscles larger and stronger. The Voth physician Relna had examined the human medical data with professional interest, and she reported to the Council's Xenobiology Committee that humans engaged in deliberate physical stress purely for recreation, and they would run for kilometers despite having vehicles, and they would climb vertical surfaces when elevators existed, and they even fought each other in organized contests they called sports. Charming, really, Relna had noted in her report, like watching juveniles play hunt when they've never known a real predator. The galaxy's dominant species had all evolved on worlds with relatively mild predation pressure, and the Voth were descended from herd animals that found safety in numbers, and the Desserans from tree-dwelling gatherers who avoided conflict, and the Krell from armored herbivores that simply outlasted any threat through their thick shells. War existed among the galactic species, of course, but it was a calculated affair, fought with drones across vast distances, and economic leverage mattered more than battlefield victories, and actual physical combat was ritualistic at best, with champions sometimes meeting in ceremonial duels that caused minimal actual harm. The humans seemed to understand this, and they adapted to galactic norms with impressive speed, and their merchant vessels began trading Earth's unique biological products throughout the outer systems, and their scientists collaborated on numerous research projects, and their artists contributed strange but fascinating cultural works. Yet there were moments that confused the other species in small ways that seemed insignificant at the time. During a joint training exercise between human security personnel and Voth station guards, the humans moved with an efficiency that seemed almost excessive, and they cleared rooms with overlapping fields of fire, and they communicated in short, rapid phrases that conveyed maximum information in minimum time, and they never stopped scanning their environment with those forward-facing eyes. They're quite intense about safety protocols, the Voth station commander had mentioned to Kelleran. Perhaps they come from a dangerous region of their homeworld. The humans also had peculiar reactions to being startled, and when a power conduit exploded during routine maintenance, the human engineer nearby didn't freeze or flee, but instead moved toward the threat to assess it, and his body language showed arousal rather than fear, with pupils dilating and breathing accelerating. The human medical officer had laughed when asked about it, and she explained that it was just adrenaline and a basic biological response that helped them react to emergencies, and she made it sound so casual and so normal. Kelleran began to notice other small things over the months of human integration into galactic society, and human children played games that involved chasing and tagging and hiding and seeking in simulated combat, and when he mentioned this seemed quite aggressive compared to Voth younglings who played cooperative puzzle games, The human parent had seemed genuinely confused. Kids need to burn off energy, the parent had said. Otherwise, they climb the walls. The phrase meant nothing to Kelleran until he actually witnessed a human child scale a 3-meter vertical surface using only small handholds, and the child was laughing the entire time. Perhaps most unsettling, though few species remarked on it, was the human smile, and it involved baring their teeth in a display that among most species signaled aggression or distress, but humans did it to show pleasure and friendship and happiness. Kelleran had studied human facial expressions from their cultural database to avoid giving offense, and he learned that humans had an extraordinary range of expressions using combinations of eyes and mouth and eyebrows and forehead muscles, and they could communicate complex emotions without speaking a word. The teeth, though, and those were clearly designed for shearing meat, and the human jaw was powerful enough to bite through tough materials, and yet humans displayed these implements casually in social situations. He raised this observation once with Ambassador Chun during a private dinner, and she had smiled again, showing those teeth, and explained that yes, humans were omnivorous, but most modern humans rarely ate meat, and many chose not to at all. Evolution gave us these tools, she had said, but we decide how to use them. It was a curious statement that Kelleran filed away in his growing collection of human peculiarities. The humans integrated themselves steadily into the galactic economy over the following year, and they established colonies on 3 unoccupied worlds within their designated expansion zone, and they built trading posts and research stations and diplomatic embassies. They followed all regulations, and they paid their council dues promptly, and they contributed meaningfully to scientific endeavors and cultural exchanges, and by all measures, they were model citizens of the galactic communities. Some species found them a bit too energetic and a bit too physical in their approach to recreation, and oddly fascinated with historical warfare and competitive activities, but these were seen as harmless quirks. The Velkar sovereignty watched from the shadows with different eyes. The Velkar were one of the few species in the galaxy that still maintained a significant military force beyond the standard defensive. Drones and their 4-armed reptilian forms had evolved on a high-gravity world where competition for resources remained fierce even after achieving civilization. They saw the humans as soft and weak and poorly defended, and the human colony ships moved through space with minimal escort because who would attack a council member in civilized space? The Vulkar had grown restless after centuries of enforced peace, and their warrior caste hungered for glory, and the council's restrictions chafed against their cultural identity, and they looked at these newcomers and saw opportunity. Would later remember the last council session before everything changed. An ambassador Chun had been presenting Earth's proposal for a joint agricultural development program, and she spoke with passion about feeding hungry populations and sharing resources and building a better future for all species. She had smiled warmly at the assembled delegates, and her eyes had crinkled at the corners in that way. Humans showed genuine joy, and no one in that chamber understood what humans were truly capable of. No one knew that humans were persistence hunters who had chased prey animals across African savannas until their targets collapsed from exhaustion. And no one knew that human endurance exceeded every galactic species by orders of magnitude, and no one knew that human ancestors had hunted megafauna to extinction on 6 continents. The galaxy was about to learn, and the education would be written in blood and fire, and the survivors would carry the lesson forever in their nightmares. But in that moment, the council chamber was peaceful, and the 3 suns shone through crystalline walls, and Ambassador Chun spoke of cooperation and friendship, and a better tomorrow for all. The colony ship Prometheus carried 8,000 souls toward their new home on the world, designated as New Terra, and the families aboard represented Earth's best and brightest, with scientists and engineers and farmers and teachers all seeking a fresh start among the stars. Captain Maria Rodriguez, commanded the vessel with quiet confidence, earned over 20 years of service, and she ran a tight ship, but a happy one where children played in the corridors and couples planned their futures. And the hydroponic gardens provided both food and a touch of home. The Prometheus had minimal defensive capabilities because Council space was supposed to be safe, and the worst threats were navigational hazards or equipment malfunctions, and pirates. Hadn't operated in this sector for 300 years. The Vulcan warship Crimson Talon dropped out of hyperspace directly in the Prometheus's path, and its weapons locked onto the colony ship before Captain Rodriguez could even process what was happening. This is Commander Zarn of the Velkar Sovereignty. The transmission came through in harsh, guttural tones. Your ship and all aboard are now property of the Velkar Empire, and you will submit immediately or be destroyed, Rodriguez felt. Ice flowed through her veins, but kept her voice steady as she responded. This is Captain Rodriguez of the Earth colony ship Prometheus, and we are a civilian vessel under Galactic Council protection, and your actions constitute an act of war. Jarns. Laughter rasped across the channel. The Council is weak and Earth is far away, and by the time anyone responds, you will all be processed and sold across the outer territories. And now stand down your engines. The Prometheus had approximately 400 able-bodied adults among the colonists, and most were civilians with families, but 17 were former military, who had mustered out to start new lives, and Captain Rodriguez was herself a retired Marine Corps officer who had commanded infantry in 3 separate peacekeeping operations. She activated the ship-wide emergency channel and spoke clearly. All personnel, this is the captain, and we are being boarded by hostile forces, and all civilians proceed to designated safe zones immediately, and all military veterans report to armory stations, and this is not a drill. The Velkar boarding pods struck the Prometheus's hull like hammers, and cutting lasers began burning through the outer plating, and Zahn had brought 60 warriors in full combat armor, expecting terrified prey to surrender within minutes. The first Velkar squad breached into Cargo Bay 3 and found it apparently empty, and the leader, Thurak, gestured his squad forward as they advanced in standard formation. The humans had cut the lights. Thurak's helmet display switched to thermal imaging, and he scanned the cargo containers and the shadows and the high ceiling catwalk. Something moved. A human dropped from above and landed on warrior Kelness, driving him to the deck, and the human's hands moved with shocking speed, disabling Kelness's helmet seals before anyone could react. Contact, contact! Thurak bellowed and brought his plasma rifle up, but the human had already rolled behind cover then. The containers themselves began moving. Humans had been hiding inside them and behind them and above them on the catwalks, and they weren't running, and they weren't surrendering, and they were hunting. The Vulkar had 4 arms and powerful builds and advanced weapons and armor, but they had never faced an enemy that used the environment as a weapon. A magnetic cargo crane swung through the squad, scattering warriors like toys, and a human woman appeared from a side corridor and threw something that exploded in Thorak's face with blinding light and deafening sound. His audio receptors screamed in overload, and he couldn't see through the after images, and something struck his knee joint with crushing force, and he went down. Humans weren't using advanced weapons, and they fought with tools and improvised explosives and lengths of metal pipe, but they fought with a coordination that spoke of training and experience. More importantly, they fought with something Thurak had never encountered before, and they seemed to be enjoying it. Through his clearing vision, he saw a human male grappling with warrior Sarek, and the human was smaller and weaker, but moved with fluid precision and redirected Sarek's superior strength against him, and swept his legs and drove him face first into the deck plating. The human was smiling. Fall back, fall back. Thurak ordered his remaining squad members, and they retreated toward the breach point, but the humans followed not in a wild charge, but in a patient, methodical advance, and they moved from cover to cover and suppressed the Velkar positions with thrown debris and the occasional burst from captured weapons, and they never stopped coming. Commander Zahn watched the tactical feeds with growing disbelief as squad after squad reported contact with organized resistance. "They're civilians," he snarled. "Crush them." But the reports kept coming, and humans were using the ship's own systems against the boarding parties, and they vented atmosphere in sealed corridors, and they overloaded power conduits to create barriers, and they moved through maintenance shafts and ventilation ducts like they owned the vessel. Warrior Praxis transmitted from Deck 7. "Commander, the humans are coordinating across all decks, and they're tracking our movements, and they know where we are before we get there." Of course they did, and Captain Rodriguez had complete access to the ship's internal sensors, and she directed her people with calm efficiency as they turned the Prometheus into a maze of death. The Vulkar expected enemies to meet them head-on in honorable combat, but humans didn't fight honorably, and they ambushed from behind, and they set traps, and they wounded Velkar warriors, then tracked the blood trails to their regrouping points. In Corridor 12, a Velkar fireteam held position behind portable shields and waited for human assault that never came. Instead, the humans cut life support to that section and simply waited. When the Vulkar tried to withdraw, they found humans waiting at every exit point and not firing but watching, and the humans followed them through the corridors, maintaining distance and herding them deeper into the ship away from their extraction points. The Velkar warriors began to panic, and panic was not something they had trained for. "They won't stop following us," Warrior Kelthus transmitted, and his voice carried an edge of fear. "We've wounded 3 of them, but they keep coming, and they're not even using cover anymore. They just walk after us." It was humanity's greatest evolutionary advantage, and persistence. Humans didn't need to be faster or stronger than their prey, and they just needed to keep going and keep tracking and never give up, and eventually, even the mightiest animal would collapse from exhaustion. The Vulkar had evolved on a high-gravity world, and their muscles were powerful, but their endurance was limited, and after 2 hours of running battles through the Prometheus's corridors, they were spent. The humans were just getting started in the main cargo bay where the first breach had occurred. A final group of 15 Velkar warriors made their stand with Commander Zarn himself leading them. Captain Rodriguez approached across the open deck with 16 humans at her back, and they carried improvised weapons and a few captured Velkar rifles, and their clothes were torn and bloody, and they moved with a loose, easy confidence. Zarn raised his weapon. "You cannot win, human, and we are superior warriors, and you should have surrendered." Rodriguez kept walking, and her expression was calm, and her eyes never left Zahn, and she spoke in a voice that carried across the bay. "You came onto my ship, and you threatened my people. And you made a mistake thinking we were prey. We are Velkar." Zarn roared. "We are the greatest warriors in the galaxy." "No," Rodriguez said, and she was close enough now that Zarn could see her eyes, and they were forward-facing predator eyes that tracked him with absolute focus. "You were the greatest warriors in past tense." She smiled, and it wasn't a friendly expression, and it showed teeth that were designed for tearing meat. "We're humans," she continued, "and on Earth we have a saying, and we hunted everything that moved until we ran out of things to hunt. And then we hunted each other for 10,000 years, until we learned to stop, and you just reminded us what we're good at." The Velkar fired first, but the humans scattered with it. Practiced precision and returned fire and closed the distance in a coordinated rush that overwhelmed the Velkar position. It was over in seconds. Shern found himself on his back with Rodriguez's knee on his chest and her hands around his throat, and she wasn't squeezing hard enough to kill, but the threat was absolutely clear. "Your ship will withdraw," she said quietly, "and you will leave our space, and you will tell everyone what happened here, and you will make sure they understand that humans are not prey." She released him and stood back. The surviving Velkar withdrew to their ship, and the Crimson Talon jumped to hyperspace within minutes of the 60 Velkar warriors who boarded the Prometheus 43 returned, and all of them carried wounds, and more than that, they carried something in their eyes that the Velkar had never seen in their warriors before. Fear Captain Rodriguez treated the wounded, both human and Velkar, with equal care and transmitted the entire encounter to Earth and to the Galactic Council. Then she continued to New Terra as planned, because she had a schedule to keep and 8,000 colonists depending on her. Behind her, the galaxy began to process what had happened, and the old assumptions began to crack. The sensor recordings played on every major world in the galaxy within 48 hours, and the Galactic Council convened an emergency session, and representatives from 47 species watched the footage in stunned silence. Ambassador Kelleran felt his sensory fronds curl in unconscious distress as he witnessed humans moving through the Prometheus's corridors, and they didn't flee from the Velkar, and they hunted them with patient, methodical precision that made his herbivore instincts scream warnings. The Thessaran military analyst Corvin froze the footage at multiple points and highlighted specific moments for the Council's review. Here, Corvin indicated a sequence where a human female tracked a wounded Velkar through 3 corridors. Notice the human's breathing remained steady, and her movements show no signs of fatigue, and the Velkar warrior outweighs her by 40 kilograms and possesses twice her strength, yet she maintained pursuit for 17 minutes until he collapsed from exhaustion. Another sequence showed a human male's pupils dilating as he prepared to engage Velkar warriors, and his lips pulled back in that tooth-displaying expression humans call the smile. Their physiology changes during combat. Corvin continued. Their adrenal systems flood their bodies with performance-enhancing chemicals, and their pain tolerance increases dramatically, and they experience something they call adrenaline rush, which they appear to find pleasurable. Word hung in the chamber like poison and pleasurable. The Krull delegate Thornax spoke with his usual bluntness. You're saying humans enjoy combat. The data suggests they're biologically rewarded for engaging in violence, Corvin replied carefully. Their brains release endorphins during physical confrontation, and this explains their recreational combat sports and competitive physical activities. Kelleran accessed Earth's biological database with growing horror as the pieces fell into place. Humans had forward-facing eyes that provided binocular vision and depth perception, and every predator species in the galactic database had this same configuration. Humans had teeth designed for both shearing meat and grinding plant matter, and their digestive systems could process nearly anything organic. Humans had extraordinary endurance compared to every known species, and their cardiovascular systems were overbuilt for their body size, and they could maintain pursuit for hours without rest. Their persistence hunters, Kelleran said aloud, and the realization made him feel physically ill. On their home world, humans chased prey animals until the prey collapsed from heat exhaustion. The database confirmed it, and human ancestors had hunted by tracking wounded animals across vast distances, and they could run at a steady pace for 20 to 30 kilometers, and they sweated to regulate temperature while their prey overheated, and humans could track by blood and broken vegetation and scent. They had hunted mammoths and giant sloths and cave bears to extinction. They had hunted everything on their planet that was large enough to be worth eating. This changes things, the Gorath delegate Marix stated flatly. We have a predator species in the Council, a sapient predator species. Ambassador Chun corrected as she stood to address the chamber, with all that implies about choice and restraint and ethical behavior. She had been silent during the presentation, and now every eye in the chamber focused on her, and some species couldn't help but track her movements the way prey animals tracked predators. Yes, or descended from hunters. Chun continued. Yes, we have biological advantages that served us on ancient Earth, and yes, we're capable of significant violence when necessary. She paused and met Kelleran's gaze directly. But we're also capable of cooperation and compassion, and we built civilization specifically to control our violent impulses, and we created laws and ethics and rules of warfare to govern our worst instincts. The Prometheus incident demonstrates exactly what happens when you threaten us. Corvin pointed out. It demonstrates restraint. Chum replied firmly. Captain Rodriguez and her people could have killed every Velkar warrior who boarded that ship, and instead they disabled them and treated their wounded and sent them home with a message. What message? Thornax demanded. Chen's expression hardened. Don't mistake our choice to be peaceful for inability to be otherwise. The council chamber erupted in debate. Then some delegates argued for restrictions on human expansion, and others called for monitoring protocols, and a few extreme voices even suggested quarantine. The Palan delegate Sarah spoke with unusual force. We cannot punish humans for defending themselves against Velkar aggression, and the sovereignty violated council law and attacked a civilian vessel. The Volkar made a mistake, Marix agreed. But this incident reveals that we've been sharing space with apex predators without understanding what that means. Ambassador Chen listened to the debate swirl around her, and she understood their fear because she would be frightened too if the situation were reversed. When the chamber finally quieted, she spoke again with measured care. I propose we share complete information about human evolution and biology and psychology with the Council in full transparency, so there are no more surprises. And in exchange, Kelleran asked quietly, you accept that being a predator species doesn't make us evil or dangerous unless we choose to be. Chum replied, and you judge us by our actions, not our ancestry. The vote took 3 hours, and the final decision was compromise, as most council decisions where humans would provide complete biological and historical data to the Galactic database, and human military capabilities would be registered and monitored, and human expansion would continue under increased observation. But humans would remain full council members with all rights and privileges. The restrictions chafed, but Chen understood they were necessary, and trust had to be rebuilt over. The following months, human diplomatic teams worked overtime to address galactic concerns, and they hosted tours of human facilities and allowed observers at military training exercises and answered countless questions about human nature. The galaxy learned that humans had indeed fought each other throughout their history, and they had wars that killed millions and developed weapons capable of destroying their entire planet. But they also learned that humans had chosen to stop after 2 global conflicts that devastated their world. Humans had created international law and built the United Nations and developed rules for warfare and established the Geneva Conventions, and they had looked at their capacity for destruction and decided to control it. We're not perfect, one human historian explained to a group of VOF students. We still have conflicts, and we still struggle with our violent impulses. But we've been working for centuries to become better than our worst instincts. The VOF students asked if humans ever worried about reverting to their predatory nature every day. The historian replied honestly, that's why we train and practice restraint and create structures to channel aggression into productive outlets, and we play contact sports instead of fighting wars, and we compete in business instead of conquering territory. The galaxy's perception of humanity shifted, and trade relationships became more formal, and fewer species sent their children to study on human worlds, and some colonies reported being avoided by neighboring settlements. It hurt, but Chun understood, and trust took time to rebuild. The Velkar sovereignty remained silent after the Prometheus incident, and Commander Zarn had been stripped of rank and exiled for his failure, and the Velkar military quietly began studying human combat techniques. Ambassador Chen met privately with Kelleran 6 months after the incident, and they shared a meal in her quarters aboard the diplomatic station. Your people fear us now, Chen observed sadly as she watched Kelleran unconsciously maintain distance. Yes, Kelleran admitted, but perhaps that's not entirely bad. Chen raised an eyebrow, and Kelleran continued. The galaxy has been at peace for so long that we forgot what violence looks like, and we forgot that some species or some individuals cannot be reasoned with diplomatically. He paused, then added, "The Velkar have raided frontier settlements for decades, and the Council issued sanctions and condemnations. But nothing changed, because we had no enforcement mechanism. And now you do," Chun said, understanding. "Now, we have a species capable of meeting force with force." Kelleran agreed. "If they choose to." "That's a lot of responsibility," Chun said quietly. "Yes," Kelleran replied. "And that's exactly why you're the right species for it." Chun didn't fully understand. Until 3 months later, when the first warnings came from deep space, the Korthian swarm had awakened, and it was hungry, and the galaxy's defensive drones were utterly inadequate against a threat that felt no fear and accepted no surrender. The Council faced extinction, and they would need to ask the Predators for help. The distress calls came from the Outer Rim territories in a cascade of terror that spread through Council space like wildfire, and entire colonies went silent within hours, and the few escape pods that made it out carried survivors with stories that made no sense. The Korthian swarm emerged from the depths of space beyond the galactic rim where no survey missions had ever ventured, and they were not a civilization in any recognizable sense, but rather a biological horror that consumed everything in their path. The first clear footage came from the Pelan Science Station Nexus 7, and the sensors captured massive organic ships that looked grown rather than built, and they disgorged thousands of creatures that defied classification. The Korthian units were vaguely insectoid, with chitinous armor and multiple limbs, and they moved with perfect coordination because they shared a hive mind and individual death meant nothing to them. The station's defensive drones engaged and destroyed hundreds of Korthian units, but thousands more kept coming, and the drones were programmed for threat assessment and target priority. And when faced with an enemy that had no commanders and no critical units and no logical structure to attack, they simply fired until their ammunition depleted. Then the Korthians swarmed over Nexus 7 and consumed every living thing aboard. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session, and military advisors from every species presented the same bleak assessment. And their defensive doctrine had been designed for rational opponents who valued their own survival. The Korthians valued nothing except consumption and growth. "Our drones cannot adapt quickly enough," the Thessaran Defense Coordinator Vex reported. Grimly, the Korthians learn from each encounter and evolve countermeasures within hours, and by the time we update our tactical algorithms, they've already moved past our responses. "What about focused bombardment?" Marek suggested. "Destroy their ships before they can deploy ground forces." "We tried that at the Taurian colony," Vex replied. "The Korthian vessels are heavily armored, and when damaged they simply absorb the destroyed sections into new configurations, and we would need to achieve complete molecular dispersal to ensure destruction." Kelleran reviewed the tactical data with growing dread, and in 3 weeks, the swarm had consumed 14 colonies and 47 space stations, and they were accelerating toward the core systems. "We need ground forces," Ambassador Chun said quietly. The chamber fell silent. "Your drone doctrine assumes enemies that fear death," Chun continued. "But living soldiers who understand they're fighting for survival fight differently, and they adapt in real time, and they can hold positions that drones would abandon as tactically unsound. Because sometimes survival isn't about optimal tactics." "You're suggesting we send living beings into close combat against those creatures," Kovan said with barely concealed horror. "I'm suggesting we ask for volunteers who are willing to fight," Chun replied. "And yes, Earth will contribute forces if the Council requests assistance." The debate raged for hours, but the casualty reports kept coming, and the Korthians were now within striking distance of the industrial worlds that supported Council infrastructure. The vote was unanimous, and the Galactic Council formally requested military assistance from Earth. Humanity's response was immediate: the transport. Ships began arriving within 72 hours, and they carried not drones, but living, breathing soldiers who called themselves Marines and wore armor that looked primitive compared to Vulcar technology, but was designed for flexibility and endurance. Major General Sarah Park commanded the expeditionary force of 50,000 troops, and she met with the Council's military coordinators in the Strategic Operations Center. We need to understand the enemy's capabilities and weaknesses and patterns, Park stated as she reviewed the combat footage. They have no weaknesses. Vex replied, they adapt to every strategy we attempt. Everything has weaknesses. Park said calmly, we just need to find them and test them. The first engagement occurred on the mining colony of Turton 5, where 15,000 Korthian units had landed and were systematically consuming the mining colony of Turton 5, where 15,000 Korthian units had landed and were systematically consuming the infrastructure. The human 1st Battalion deployed directly into the combat zone, and instead of establishing defensive positions, they moved aggressively toward the Korthian advance. Sergeant Marcus Williams led his platoon through the colony's industrial sector, and they moved building to building in coordinated fire teams, and when they encountered Korthian units, they didn't retreat to optimal firing positions. They held their ground and fought contact front. Williams called as a wave of Korthians surged around a corner, grenades out. The explosions tore through the leading creatures, and the Marines opened fire with kinetic weapons that the Korthians had never encountered before. Hive Mind adapted quickly, and the next wave came from multiple directions, attempting to flank and surround. They're trying to envelope us, Corporal Janet Torres observed. Let them try, Williams replied, and he pulled his platoon into a tighter defensive circle. The Korthians crashed against the Marines like a wave against rocks, and the humans didn't break. They had fought in urban terrain on Earth for generations, and they knew how to use buildings and choke points and killing zones, and more importantly, they knew how to stay calm when the enemy was close enough to touch. Korthians discovered something unexpected, and humans fought back even when wounded, and they carried their injured from the battlefield, and they never abandoned their positions even when tactically surrounded. After 6 hours of continuous combat, the Korthians withdrew from Turton 5, not because they feared destruction, but because the humans were inflicting unacceptable losses relative to gains. General Park analyzed the battle reports and found the pattern she was looking for. They're efficient, she explained to the council coordinators. They calculate cost versus benefit, and when resistance exceeds consumption value, they disengage and seek easier targets. So we make everywhere hard, Calran said, understanding. Exactly. Park confirmed, we show them that every world will cost them dearly. The human Marines deployed across threatened sectors, and they taught other species volunteers how to fight in close quarters and how to hold positions under overwhelming assault and how to trust the soldier beside. Youth Voss Soldier Prelm trained with a human instructor named Gunnery Sergeant Kim Rodriguez, and she pushed him far beyond what he thought his body could endure. Your people are herd animals, right? Rodriguez said during a break in training. Yes, Prelm replied between gasping breaths. Then you understand the instinct to protect the herd. Rodriguez continued. That's what we're doing here. And every position we hold is protecting someone's home and someone's family. And when you remember that the pain doesn't matter as much. Prelm watched human Marines prepare for deployment, and they checked each other's equipment and shared jokes, and some prayed to various human deities, and they showed no signs of the fear he felt. Are you not afraid? He asked Rodriguez. Terrified, she replied honestly. Every time, but fear is just information, and it tells you the stakes are high, and what you do with that fear determines who you are. The Korthian war escalated as the swarm committed more forces, and the battles became brutal and close quarters, and The casualty rates were horrific, but the line held in the agri-world of plenty human Marines and Voth volunteers fought side by side against a Corthian assault that lasted 16 hours, and when ammunition ran low, they fought with blades, and when blades broke, they fought with whatever they could. Finprone found himself back-to-back with a human corporal named Davis, and they held a warehouse entrance against a seemingly endless tide. "This is insane," Preln gasped. "Yeah," Davis agreed, "but it's our insane, and we own it." They held until reinforcements arrived. The galaxy watched as humans demonstrated something that had been forgotten in 12,000 years of civilized warfare. Sometimes you fight not because victory is certain, but because surrender is unacceptable. The Corthians adapted their tactics, but humans adapted faster, and they used the swarm's hive mind against them by creating false patterns and then exploiting the coordinated response. Major Park led a strike team that infiltrated a Corthian bioship and planted tracking beacons that allowed the Council fleet to target the vessel's central coordination nodes. And when those nodes were destroyed, thousands of Corthian units lost cohesion simultaneously. Tide began to turn. Human Marines taught other species that warfare wasn't about technology or superiority, but about will, and humans had learned through bitter experience that the side willing to endure more would eventually prevail. The final battle occurred in the Keshan system, where the Corthians had massed their largest force for a push toward the Council's core worlds. Every available ship and soldier from 40 species met them there, and humans stood shoulder to shoulder with Voth and Thessaran, and even Velkar warriors who had requested to fight alongside the species that had humiliated them. The battle lasted 3 days. When it ended, the Corthian swarm was broken, and the surviving bioships fled back toward the galactic rim. And pursuit forces harried them every step of the way. General Park stood on the bridge of the Council flagship Harmony and watched the retreat with tired eyes, and her uniform was torn and blood-stained, and she had been awake for 48 hours. Ambassador Chun joined her, and together they looked at the casualty. The memorial gardens on Masara grew in carefully tended spirals that represented the interconnected nature of all galactic life, and the newest section honored those who had fallen during the Corthian War, and among the crystalline markers that bore names from 40 species human markers stood alongside all the others. Ambassador Kelleran walked the paths with Captain Maria Rodriguez, who had traveled from New Terra specifically for the dedication ceremony, and they moved in comfortable silence. "Between the markers, your people changed us," Kelleran said. Finally, Rodriguez considered this before responding. "You changed yourselves, and we just showed you what was already there." "No," Kelleran replied gently. "Before the war, we believed civilization meant the absence of violence, and we thought we had evolved beyond such primitive necessities." He paused at a marker bearing a Voth name and continued. "Prelm was my cousin, and he volunteered after Turthan V and fought in 7 major engagements. And he wrote to me before the final battle at Keshan." Kelleran produced a data crystal and activated the recording, and Prelm's image appeared, speaking with quiet intensity. "I understand now why humans train as they do." The recorded Prelm said, "Physical strength matters when you're carrying a wounded comrade, and endurance matters when the battle lasts longer than anyone expected, and discipline matters when every instinct screams to run." The recording continued, "But mostly I understand that choosing to fight for something greater than yourself gives meaning to existence, and I'm not ashamed to be afraid, and I'm proud to stand with those who face their fear." Anyway, Rodriguez felt tears on her cheeks, and Preln had not survived Keshan. He died holding a medical station. Kelleran said he and 2 human Marines kept the Corthians away from the wounded for 6 hours, until reinforcements arrived, and 73 soldiers of 5 different species survived because of them. They walked on, and the gardens were filling with beings from across the galaxy who had come to remember. The war had ended 8 months ago, but its effects rippled through every aspect of galactic society. The most obvious change was physical, and the Voth had established mandatory fitness training for all citizens, and the Vesserons built gymnasiums in every major city, and even the Krell, with their naturally armored bodies, began endurance programs. "Your people are adopting human habits," Rodriguez observed as they passed a group of young Voth practicing martial arts under human instruction. "We're adopting warrior practices," Kelran corrected, "and preparing for the possibility that the Korthians may return, or that some other threat may emerge from the darkness between stars." But the changes went deeper than physical preparation. Galactic Council had restructured its entire defense apparatus, and drone fleets were being supplemented with living soldiers, and every species contributed volunteers to a new multi-species defense force. Rodriguez had been asked to help train the first integrated units and teaching species who had never fought together how to function as cohesive teams. "The hardest part isn't the tactics," she had reported to General Park. "It's teaching them to trust each other when the situation gets desperate. That takes time and shared experience," Park had replied. "And they're building both." Voth soldiers trained alongside humans and learned that humans sang before battles to steady their nerves, and the songs varied from solemn hymns to crude marching chants that made even hardened Marines laugh. The Vesserons taught humans meditation techniques that helped manage combat stress, and their natural patience complemented human intensity in unexpected ways. The Krell discovered that their armored bodies made them excellent heavy assault troops when paired with human tactical coordination. Even the Velkar joined the integrated training programs, and initially tensions ran high given the history with the Prometheus, but shared combat had a way of burning away old grudges. Commander Zarn himself appeared at a joint training exercise unannounced and requested to speak with Captain Rodriguez privately. They met in a simple room with 2 chairs, and Zarn stood at attention before speaking. "I owe you an apology and my debt of honor," he said formally. "I mistook your restraint for weakness and endangered your people through my arrogance." Rodriguez studied him carefully before responding. "You paid for that mistake, and what matters now is what you do going forward." "I wish to learn," Zarn replied simply. "My people were warriors, but we never truly understood what that meant until we fought beside humans at Keshen. And we knew how to kill, but you know why killing matters, and when it's necessary, and when it's not." It was perhaps the most profound observation any Velkar had ever made about humans. The training programs evolved to include not just combat techniques, but human military ethics, and the Geneva Conventions were translated into 47 languages, and the concept of laws of warfare was revolutionary to species who had only known either ritualized combat or total war. "You're saying there are rules even in war?" a Pilon cadet asked during one session. "Especially in war," the human instructor replied, "because war brings out our worst impulses, and without rules we become the monsters we're fighting against." The instructor was Gunnery Sergeant Kim Rodriguez, and she had been decorated 4 times during the Korthian War, and she taught with the authority of experience. "Humans learned this the hard way," she continued. "We fought wars where we ignored the rules, and the aftermath was so horrific that we created international law to prevent it from happening again." She showed them images from human history and wars that had devastated Earth, and the students reacted with shock. "You did this to yourselves?" one asked. "Yes," Rodriguez replied, "without shame. And then we decided to do better, and that's the point. And being capable of terrible things doesn't make you evil unless you choose to do them." The lesson resonated across the galaxy, and being a predator or warrior species wasn't about capacity for violence, but about the choice to control. Iteran had been elected to the Council's new security committee, and he worked alongside human military advisors to develop protocols for future threats. "We're creating something unprecedented," he told Ambassador Chun during one planning session. A true defensive alliance where every species contributes according to their strengths and trusts others to fill their weaknesses. Chun added that's the hard part. The trust was building, though, in unexpected ways. Human combat medics trained Desseran healers in battlefield medicine and Desseran patients helped humans develop better long-term care protocols. Krell engineers worked with human technicians to create armor systems that protected both species. Unique physiologists, logistics coordinators, managed supply lines with human efficiency experts and created distribution networks that kept armies supplied across multiple star systems. The galaxy was learning to work together not just in trade and diplomacy, but in the intimate trust required when lives depended on each other. Rodriguez returned to New Terra after the memorial ceremony and found her colony thriving, and the settlement had grown substantially with new arrivals, including families from 3 other species, who chose to live among humans. The human children played with Voth and Desseran younglings, and their games involved both human sports and alien traditions, and Rodriguez watched a mixed group playing something that looked like soccer, but with 3 balls and additional rules she didn't quite understand. They're creating something new, her second officer Marcus Chun observed, not human culture or Voth culture, but something that incorporates both. It was happening across council space and humans. Open restaurants on alien worlds and other species, established businesses on Earth, and cultural exchange flourished in ways it never had before the war. The galaxy had learned that humans were predators, but had also learned what that really meant, and not mindless killers or savage beasts, but beings who understood violence intimately enough to know when and how to control it. More importantly, humans had shown that strength could protect rather than dominate. General Park visited the council chambers 6 months after the war's end to present the final report on integrated military operations, and the assembled delegates listened as she outlined successes and failures and recommendations for future development. The most significant finding, Park concluded, is that multi-species units perform better than predicted across all metrics, and soldiers who train together and fight together develop bonds that transcend species differences. She paused and added, "We're stronger together than any of us could be alone." The applause was genuine, and Park had become something unexpected during the war, and she was humanity's face to the galaxy, but also the galaxy's champion, and she fought for all species equally. Afterward, Ambassador Chun joined her for a private dinner, and they sat overlooking the Zara's capital city with its lights spreading across the landscape. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Park asked quietly, "showing them how to be warriors." "I think we showed them how to defend what matters," Chun replied. "And there's a difference." "Is there?" Park pressed. "We've militarized an entire galaxy that lived in peace for millennia." Chun considered this seriously before answering. They lived in peace because nothing threatened them. And when a real threat emerged, their peace made them vulnerable, and now they can defend their peace. And if someday they use what we taught them against each other? Park asked.